You're about to enter into a podcast conversation that I had with Noni Potter, who is an expert on trauma and grief. I can't tell you how good this is and was. What I'm really hoping and believing for is that for some of you, it's going to unlock awareness and knowledge and give you a roadmap through some of your grief and trauma. So I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Noni, to 360 Woman Chit Chats. I'm so excited to have you as part of one of my hand-picked guests, very hand-picked. And I think, firstly, I'll tell the audience, we go a long way back.
We do go a long way back.
and then somehow, you know, in recent years kind of landed back together. So our parents were like best friends, grew up together, and then, which means we obviously did. And then we really didn't see each other for a long time.
Yeah, probably, 20.
Yeah. I was going to say,
decades.
Yeah. And then landed back in, I guess, the realm of counselling, and you became my
I know, how funny.
You became my lecturer, and obviously, I was last year now, was it? I lose track of time.
It's a bit of a blur for me, but I think it was last year.
Yeah, you know, forever finishing my masters. Don't judge me.
No judgment.
I think I got 2 summers ago, and I came and did your trauma intensive, which obviously was phenomenal. And so our lives have kind of come back in a professional sense as well, which is kind of cool, right?
Yeah, it's lovely.
It's so Adelaide as well, I think. Mm-hmm. So when I was thinking about the 360 Woman Project and having my handpicked people, you are absolutely one of them for so many reasons. And you won't say this, but I'll say this: you are, you know, so well renowned in this space. You're such an expert and wealth of knowledge around trauma and grief. And it's obviously an interesting topic, right? Because it probably to many people sounds very boring, or not boring, but depressing and heavy. And why do we want to talk about it? But I think that there's such a wealth to having these conversations.
I absolutely
agree. Such a wealth. And I guess just to start with, just to give the watchers or the listeners an idea of what you do and how you kind of landed in this space, because it wasn't what you started. You didn't start your professional career.
No,
right? You landed here later in life, which I think is awesome.
Yeah, a big surprise to me too that I landed here. It wasn't on the radar, but I actually worked as a pastor for I think 17 years. And what really happened was that I was really interested in working in that kind of emotional well-being, mental health space. Yeah. And so I think there was a measure of effectiveness in being able to support people, but I really felt like I needed to upskill. And so I actually went back in my late 40s to do my Masters of Counselling Practice, which was really unexpected. It was quite a sharp life turn.
Actually, I remember meeting you for coffee at Marion when you were trying to make the decision. I just remember that.
I think I spoke to you about how do I do this and where do I go.
Yeah.
And so I ended up, I did go and study at Table College, did my Masters, which, you know, I remember from the first lecture I went into, I just thought, I've just found my thing. This is my thing. And so I did my Masters. I still work in private practice. But I actually ended up, I started teaching in that program. I'm the head of the undergrad program there. So I do that. I work as a counsellor and a supervisor of other counsellors. And I also ended up writing a book in that space. So,
so you have not mugged around, have you?
I have.
Like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it all. Right? That's amazing.
I guess so. And you know, it was just so fascinating to me. I've loved working with people. And I think, like you said, I found it so life-giving. I remember studying grief and loss and being really terrified of it because I didn't want to do it either. I was not comfortable with talking about death, didn't want to think about it. And it was one of the best things I ever did. Number one, helped me sit comfortably in that space. But it was so rich and full of hope, and it was just one of the really profound moments of my life. And
like grief for me, I remember we obviously studied the same course at different time, and when the grief topic came up, like I'm actually embarrassed to say this, but I remember saying to the lecturer, I'm not going to do that subject because I'm not working with anyone that has grief, right? And I remember her looking at me going, Interesting. And then it became this, again, one of my favorite subjects because where do people learn grief other than in the trenches?
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Where do they learn it?
Absolutely.
And I think that, especially with what you do as well, it's that teaching people to navigate grief is such a powerful tool because we all go through it.
We do. I think one of the phrases that really stood out to me, and I know grief refers to more than, the loss through death.
Correct.
I remember one of the phrases was death is a part of life. And I'm going, oh, wow.
Yeah.
And we don't really do grief well in our culture. I think we're very well, particularly in terms of death. There's many other kinds of loss. But we're very isolated from these things, through we're not really around the rural areas nowadays where we see that kind of life cycle. We are people who are aging and dying and not generally in the home or the community so much. And so we're very kind of death aversive. We don't even like the word.
No.
So passed away. But, whereas other cultures, dying is just a normal part of life and it's not as taboo or scary.
Yeah. And it's also, they've got traditions and milestones around it, which I think is really important because, as you said, I don't think people, if we're just talking death, I don't think our society does it well.
No.
Right? At all. We don't know how to navigate that. But then I guess in the bigger conversation around grief, we don't know how to do that well either.
We don't.
Or we don't know actually how to support people in it. That's probably more to the point.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest things I notice is that, and as you say, like grief can be so many losses, where even life transitions at times.
Correct.
But what I've noticed is people are so uncomfortable in that space, and they'll often do really unhelpful things like either avoid it or try and put the silver lining on the cloud, make it all when really what people need is acknowledgement and validation and just to be seen, heard, processed and allowed. I think the biggest thing that stood out to me when I studied it was my lecturer saying we need to learn how to accompany people in grief and to be okay holding that space when it is sad and it is difficult and actually just being able to be there with people and
not necessarily knowing what to do or how to do it, but just the giving permission, I think.
Yeah.
Because do you find in your practice and in your lecturing and professional world, I think it feels like there's a sense of urgency for people to get on with it.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Because if you're okay, then I'm okay.
Yeah, and that's more about our own discomfort. I think that, it's very confronting when someone else is going through grief because if we're not comfortable or haven't sort of done that work in ourselves, then it's very uncomfortable to go there. But actually we all grieve at many different stages through life. Yeah. And one of the most liberating things that I think I learned was actually that grief is a really helpful process to go through because we do need to mourn losses and we also have to reinvent our worlds.
Yeah.
And actually the grieving process is a process that allows you to do both of those things.
I like that, the reinventing.
Yeah.
Because it is a reinventing of where something's gone or changed or that is then the whole, okay, well, who am I now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, what do I do now kind of space?
Absolutely. And I think they're the two kind of sides of grieving. One is the whole, dealing with these big distressing emotions and the reality of the changes. That's one side. But the other side is, wow, there's all these massive changes. There's practical changes, like maybe, if you think about something like the loss of a partner, whether that's through separation, divorce or death, all of a sudden there's things that I've got to do that I didn't have to do before or skills I might need to learn. There's this sense of I'm so used to, internally my identity that I'm used to being part of a couple. Yeah. And now I'm not. I'm me. And how do I even make meaning of all of this?
And I even think some of the in my workbook I was writing about how for widows that for the first time have to tick that box, widow. Yeah. I mean, that is horrifying. Isn't it? In that space, just to go, that's my box now.
So confronting. I often say, I've been married for, I think it's 38 years, but we had to...
Hang on, stop. What?
Now I'm 38 years.
Yeah, no, pretty quite. No, that is amazing. All right.
Which I'm delighted about. But for about 5 years, my husband travelled a lot. He was away a lot. And it was really interesting. Now, obviously, we were still together, but navigating life as a single person.
Yeah.
And I remember just going to a wedding and thinking, this is really different.
Yeah.
Being here on my own without the other
wingman.
It's such a different thing. And all those unseen adjustments. I mean, there's some obvious adjustments like who's going to fix the pool or the technology, But it's those unseen adjustments, that internal sense of who am I now and what does this look like?
Yeah. And often when life has happened to us, right?
Yeah.
Versus even when we've chosen and made choices, that's difficult too. That it's not about one's easier than the other. But I think when it's happened to us, there's a different level to process, right?
Absolutely.
There's
Yeah. But it's interesting what you say, because there's also things that people don't associate with grief, like, we might change jobs, and that might be a good choice in many ways, but there can still be a sense of loss. Or when our kids grow up and leave home, and that can be so exciting because we want that for them.
Yeah.
Want them to do well, but there's still a layer of grieving on that. So it's not always grieving over terrible things that have happened, but we can go through life transitions that actually there's a level
that
of loss that impact us, and we don't even realise it. And it's okay.
And do you find in your practice, like I do in mine, that often I use the word grief? Like someone will sit down and go da 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 da, and I'll go, oh, that sounds like a real grief, and they are mortified, or they're like, sorry, no, it's not grief, right? That they don't even associate their experience with or to grief.
Yeah.
And then you name it, and it can go one of two ways. One is actually it's really validating and, oh, yes, that's actually what and other times they can become defensive and reactive.
Yeah. It's really interesting because, I have noticed, sometimes, as you said, they're just not aware.
No.
That sometimes can be quite liberating. I was working with a lady who had lost their home through a natural disaster, and a number of years later they'd actually had a beautiful, beautiful new home. And we were just chatting, and they're saying how, everyone comes in and says, what an amazing house, what a lovely house. And she felt guilty because she just couldn't really connect with it. And I said, well, I think you're maybe still grieving the other house that you loved. And she said, yes, I am. And it was just giving her permission that it was almost like because she had a beautiful home, she wasn't allowed to grieve the old home. But actually she was, because she loved it. And so,
and it was taken from her, right?
It was taken, and often I think we disenfranchise people's grief like that because maybe we're grieving someone because we made a poor decision or, but it does, nonetheless, grief still is there and it's still a journey.
Yeah, or similar, like when someone, leaves a partner of long term and maybe it's been coming for a long time and then you hear people say, oh, but you wanted this.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, if we really dig deep on that, I didn't really want this. This is not what I would have chosen for my life. But yes, I made that active decision. But you're right, it really dismisses the root system of suffering.
Yeah, it really does. And as you say, not many people go into relationships saying, hey, I want this to not end well. But there's lots of reasons
that it doesn't.
Yeah, and so there's so much grief, in that. And so, I think, for me, I just see grief as a really normal part of life. And, most people who come to counselling, not many of them come with their primary concern being a grief issue. But when you're working with people, I don't know if you find this, grief is often there.
Oh,
it's absolutely there.
Well, that's what makes me cringe about when I said to the lecturer all those years ago, I'm not doing it. Because literally no matter what comes into my room, grief is always somewhere. On the chessboard, right?
Yeah, it is.
It's always, and it kind of underarches and, and holds a lot of things. And as we were saying, for many people, they don't rationalize it as grief because grief is seen as the big ticket items.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And so I probably like you, I constantly want to normalize people's experience and feelings, and it can be really minor things.
Yeah.
But people feel bad about that. It's just about giving people that awareness. And I do want to interject here with a little bit of a tout out for counselling, because I think you and I both know that as counsellors, a lot has changed over the years. I've been doing this for 14 years, and there's a lot more acceptance of people needing therapy.
I think so. Yeah.
But there is still that resistance and I guess, belief system that it's for people that can't cope in life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You still see that and hear that.
Still seeing
So as an expert in trauma and grief, like why do you think therapy, and it doesn't necessarily just need to be talk therapy, but why do you believe it's really important? Someone's probably sitting here watching this today who might, after our conversation, go, I didn't realize it, but maybe how I'm feeling is grief. Why do you believe counselling is a really helpful tool?
Yeah. I think firstly, grief is really misunderstood, poorly understood, I think, in our nation. And I think some of the attitudes that, I mean, this is changing.
Yeah.
But some of the attitudes in Australia, like suck it up, princess, get over it.
It is what it is.
Tell someone who cares. Yeah. And I think, the reality is some people grieve some things and they have got a really great support network and they manage that really well. Mm-hmm. But I think the nature of grief, particularly when you've lost something that is very dear and meaningful and part of your life, it's not just like, I just need to talk about it once, then I'm over it. This is a journey, and you might need to talk about it 10 or 20 or 30, And so sometimes you've got those support people who really get it and are prepared to go there with you. But often there's not that level of understanding. And so I think what happens with grief, particularly when someone is going through quite a deep season of grief, maybe they've lost someone really close to them or something's happened that's really profound in their life, often they need to be able to talk about that again and again and again. And sometimes we have those support people in our world who are okay with that, but often we don't.
And it wears thin.
It wears thin after 2 or 3 times. And so what I probably really appreciate about counselling is that as a counsellor, my whole goal is to be here for you and with you and accompany you. The focus is on where are you at, what's happening for you. I'm comfortable to sit in the space with grief, but I also have some awareness and insight of the journey of grief because it,
there is a science to it, isn't there, or a pattern and a process.
There is. I mean, it's not a linear, exact linear, but there are definitely different things that you engage with and through the grief journey and milestones. And so firstly, just having someone who's actually okay to sit with you in your deep grief and be okay with that and be comfortable and be able to listen to your memories, hear about what's so difficult, let you cry, and that's not going to freak out, And so counsellors are really comfortable in that space, but also, the journey of moving forward with dealing with some of the things we spoke about, what is it like trying to have to manage life on my own, raise children on my own, whatever it is. And then but also there's some really, really beautiful parts of grief. And I think, and everyone's timing is so different and so unique. Some people, it's more intense, some take a lot longer. But this idea of, yes, we're dealing with the pain, yes, we're dealing with all of that, but also there is this other side of grief that is, how do I reinvent my world? What do I...
The transformation, right?
What do I want my life to look like? But also what I think one of the most key things I've heard is, and again, I'm going back to the example of loss of a person, which I know is only accounts for a small percentage of people who are grieving, but even to find ways, if I've lost something in my life that was really beautiful or meaningful to me, how do I actually find a way, if it's a person, to love them in absence instead of presence? And how do I find a way to take them forward with me? What is it, what did maybe they see in me that they really loved about me that I can take forward in my life? And how did they influence me in a way that was really helpful? And how can I honour them and move forward in life while remembering them? So it's a really hope-filled way of reinventing my world that doesn't leave the person or thing we've lost behind necessarily, but goes, how do I be transformed by that and move forward while remembering that space? So,
and it's really powerful, isn't it? Because I think one of the things that I see a lot of in my counselling room, and even I've experienced it myself, is that sometimes the people in our life don't love the new us.
That's right.
Right?
That's
they are like, they want the old us, and the old us is often gone, right?
Yeah.
When there's been that moment in life.
Yep.
And so it can be quite isolating and confronting when people expect a certain version and that version has gone and a new version is evolving, and often it's, very transformed and it's good, and sometimes it's a bit bad and ugly and all of the things.
All of it.
And there can be a real reaction to that.
Absolutely.
I remember many years when I was going through IVF, and it was such a grief process for like 8 years, and it really changed me fundamentally. And I'll never forget that someone said to me, like, when's the old Lisa coming back? Because she used to be really fun. And I remember in that moment, A, wanting to throat punch.
Yep.
And B, just going, she's not.
No.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
I didn't want it to be okay. I loved the old me too.
Yeah.
I didn't really necessarily like the new me. I didn't even know her. I was trying to adapt to her. I was trying to understand her. I was trying to get comfortable in her skin. Yeah. And then to have someone say that, it was so like jarring. And it was one of those moments, when you remember what you're wearing, where you were, like, it's one of those moments that I was like, yeah. And that's why this relationship is done.
Because what they're really saying is, A, I'm not comfortable with your grief, but B, I'm not comfortable with your growth.
Yes.
And loss transforms us. Now, none of us want to often go through that journey.
No, I didn't want it.
Or that long. We don't want that.
No.
But there is this deep transformation that happens through the pain and the suffering, and there is actually a growth. Mm-hmm. There's vicarious growth that comes out of that. Yeah. And we're not the same. No. I mean, that's life. We grow and change, and sometimes the people around us, that changes relationship dynamics. It does. And they don't always. Some people celebrate that, but other people don't cope with that.
And then that's another grief for people, of the loss of relationships or the loss of an experience, because we're trying to deal with transformation, we're trying to deal with loss, we're trying to deal with growth, but then we've got double loss.
Right? Yeah, we do. We get these secondary losses that happen, through grief. And that's often the other thing. People see what the first loss is, so maybe, someone's in a relationship and their partner leaves them, but they don't necessarily, I mean, there's all these, often it's not just that, it's in the secondary losses as well. Now I've got to be a single mum and work and try to,
I've not done that before, and
and so then I'm not available for my friends. So there's lots of there's all the things I used to do, and finances, hobbies, and so there's so many other losses that can happen in the grief space. I think that can, and honestly, I just feel like saying to people that there's nothing like a really faithful friend that will actually just navigate, stand in the life with you no matter what. Yeah. And we all need a handful of, and you can't really, I don't know that you can do those relationships for more than a handful of people, but we all need a handful of people, and we need to be that for a handful of people. We are just there no matter what. Yeah. We've walked the journey, but
that's seen every variety of ourselves. Right?
Best and worst version.
I know, right? And are still standing, right? And still standing, and can still remind us of who we were. And how we maybe responded in life, but can still sit in the current and go, but I love and value this.
Yes, that's right.
Because that's, I think, what we need.
Yeah, and I know in my life, those are the friendships that are the deepest. Yeah, and they've been tested by fire.
Yeah.
But they're the ones that, no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, and look, to be honest, I mean, I'm privileged to have some of those friends, but I also feel like not everyone can look around and go, hey, I've got a handful of friends like that. I wish that for everyone. But honestly, again, I think that's where sometimes we just need someone outside of our personal world. Yeah. Where we just know we can go. Yep. And we can just be us, whatever, however ugly
unapologetic.
And I think that's where counseling's so lovely, because sometimes you're so vulnerable and it's not your best version of yourself. It's your worst, and you need someone that actually is there for you for that. And it's not necessarily going to affect all your relationships. Yeah. And sometimes that's when counselling is really helpful, because they're not in your personal world. No. And you can go there with all that stuff, but there's a lot of protection and safety in that.
And I think it's the permission to say the ugly.
That's right.
Right? And I often say to people, there is nothing you can say in this room that I probably haven't heard before, that I'm going to be shocked by, that I'm going to judge and be like, oh my goodness, like this is the safest space because I can do ugly.
Yeah.
Right? I can do ugly.
Absolutely.
I am so okay with ugly.
Absolutely.
And I think that gives people permission to go, I can't believe I just said that out loud.
No. And I think that's what counselling does, is the core thing of counselling. I mean, that there's many,
facets,
bells and whistles and wonderful things we can do, but I think the core thing is we create a safe place for you where no matter what, we are here for you. We are on your court, on your team.
Yeah.
We are here for you, and we generally care, and we get it. Like that. We might not have. I'm not saying we've been through what you've been through, but we get it that life sucks at times, and that it's really hard, and things are a big mess. And that's we actually want to be the safe place where it doesn't matter what you say in that space.
Yeah, to detangle.
It's okay.
Yeah,
it's okay, and we're there for you, and it's not going to mess up any of your other relationships or anything like that. And we can help you process that too, in a way that's healthy.
Yeah,
because we all have to process.
We all do. We all
muck in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
No one's immune.
No. So I guess just pivoting, I could talk about grief all day because I think it's such a powerful change agent.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
On so many levels. Yeah. But just, I guess, pivoting a little into the trauma stuff, right? Because they often go hand in hand.
Very much. Yeah.
And I know this is an area that you're specifically outstanding at and have a real wealth of knowledge. And I guess I'll start the conversation by saying, and tell me if you don't agree, but I feel like we have become way more aware of trauma. But the word trauma has been so overused, and I feel like there's a flippancy to it now, and it bothers me.
Yeah, I totally hear you. I think because it almost, I'm trying to think of the word, minimises.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand people can feel a bit traumatized. We use that word, I feel traumatized by it. But, almost I often think of a spectrum. And really there's a difference between having a bad conversation with your boss and
having a traumatic
going
event.
through a sexual assault.
Yep.
Or even worse, as a child going through trauma all through childhood years. They're very different ends of the spectrum. And I think we need to understand there's a difference between an upsetting event that we bounce back from within a day or two and something that is affecting us weeks, months and years, decades through our life. And so I think in a therapeutic sense, when we're thinking about trauma, a very simple definition of trauma is something that overwhelms our capacity to cope. But really, I think it's a lot more than that, because it's not just, look, I can't cope for a week or a day. It's like, no, it's this event was so overwhelming that it's really affected the way my brain and my body process, and I haven't been able to process that in the way they normally would. And that thing is staying in my body, in my cells. It is not processed and stored away as past memory.
No.
It's actually still triggered.
Very alive.
Very alive. Not just like I can remember an upsetting conversation I had yesterday and feel the feelings, but I know it's yesterday. In trauma, it's like when I remember it, it's so overwhelming. I feel like it's happening to me again right now. And it's really hard to even recognize that it's just a memory.
Yeah.
So it's very, very overwhelming. And I think the severity of what we really refer to as maybe like PTSD or complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is really in a therapeutic sense what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma, as opposed to, I had a traumatic.
Yeah, like it's so traumatic. I know, like I hear that and I go, stop.
Yeah.
Because, trauma, as you know, is like changes lives.
Yeah.
Right? And sometimes on the daily.
Yeah.
And it's very real.
Very real.
And it's not to be mocked.
No. And I think, what I find with trauma is, number one, for people who've been through trauma, it's really helpful for them to understand why they're experiencing some of the things. Because I think it's really scary if you've been through a traumatic event and you're having some of the symptoms of, let's say, PTSD, and you're having flashbacks, you're having all these kind of things happening, nightmares, you're constantly on this high level of alert and you can't relax, and, it's just messed with. I think sometimes people feel like they're going mad. And so to be able to just to sit and say, no, hang on, let's just explain, this is how your brain and body have tried to protect you and work through something that was more than you could cope with. And of course, even more so for people who've been through ongoing trauma in childhood years, particularly with someone they know, where it's not just those sort of what we refer to as the symptoms of PTSD, it's also affected the whole sense of who I am and my self-worth, my identity, I haven't really developed, how can I develop that capacity to regulate my emotions or understand my emotions, where I've never had a safe person there for me. And of course that bleeds out into all of our relationships. So I often find just sitting with someone and helping them understand why they're facing the things they're facing and actually understand it can in itself be
things, right?
Yeah, be really helpful. And while it doesn't answer it, I mean, there's lots of other things we can do to work through some of those things, but it can be so helpful and such a relief to understand, okay, this is why I'm struggling with this, or this is why this is going on.
So what would you say to the person who's like, listen, I've had trauma. I know I've got trauma responses. I know I've created a life that protects those little compartmentalized boxes that I'm never going to go to therapy about. So let's be very clear, I'm not doing therapy. What would you say to the person, or what ingredients or skills do you think you could encourage them to experience for them to support their own trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing I would always say, which may be relevant for some of the watchers or listeners, is that you need to make sure you're safe. So the first thing I would say, that if anyone is watching this or listening and you don't feel like you're in a safe circumstance, then that's the most important thing. So, call 1-800-RESPECT or the domestic violence hotline, crisis line. That's my first thing.
Absolutely.
But if you that there's trauma in your past, but actually currently you're in a safe place and you don't want to go to therapy, I think there's a number of things that you can do that are really helpful. I think one of the things that I've found is really helpful for people who've been through any kind of trauma is to retrain your mind and body to not be constantly in that flight, fight response. So one of the things about going through trauma, that overwhelming event or events, is that it can leave us with, I guess, like an oversensitive smoke alarm, where we're constantly on high alert, constantly triggering, having big body reactions, which are really distressing. So there's some ways that you can explore that can help you retrain your body and mind. It's interesting. One of the experts on trauma, Bessel van der Kolk, he actually did some research, and they found that for people who do yoga, and you can do trauma-informed yoga now, that actually was as effective as any medications they'd used for trauma, because what it did, it taught people how to start to feel safe in their bodies again. And
so powerful.
Even though it was distressing, sometimes they knew that this had a time frame, was coming to an end. So it helped increase people's tolerance and the capacity to feel safe in their bodies and reconnect. I think also, there's so many, and I'm sure there's loads of apps, or you could Google this, there's so many techniques of breathing that actually shift our brain and our body out of that flight-fight mode into a more relaxed present state. So it's very much exploring what works for you. It's never one
such an individual thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and even, along those, but exploring calm breathing, finding something that works for you. Breathing doesn't work for everyone, but it does work for a lot of people. And then the other thing that is really interesting, I think, is this idea of mindfulness. And when I say mindfulness, people think of a lot of different things, but even just simply being able to tune in to the present moment and to notice what's going on with our five senses around us.
Yeah.
That can, it might be as simple as, I say to people, find something in your day, like if you enjoy coffee, when you're having a cup of coffee, spend 30 seconds or a minute savouring that
experiencing the
tuning into all of your five senses and teaching and relearning how to enjoy something. But the added advantage of mindfulness, or really tuning in to the present moment and our five senses, is that if you're struggling with things like flashbacks or getting triggered, then often, even though you're having these awful feelings inside, if you've trained your five senses to go, even though it feels like I was going through that trauma, but I can see right now that I'm sitting here, I'm in this room, I can hear the cars outside, I've got adult shoes on. Even though it feels horrible, I'm here and I'm okay. Those things can be really useful. I think the other thing that is really important, and this is probably especially for people who've been through trauma throughout their childhood, one of the most, and there's been so much damage done through abusive relationships, one of the most important things is to try and discover relationships that can be healing, what I would call a safe, secure relationship. And that's not always easy. And sometimes people don't even know what to look for if they've never experienced that. But, what does it look like to find role models or people who treat you with respect, who listen to what you're saying because they want to understand you, who are trustworthy, who do what they'll say, who respect your boundaries, who know how to have good boundaries, who want the best for you. And sometimes, looking, you might just start to observe and think about the relationships around you, not only your own relationships, but look at relationships of people you know, and think, or even, if you don't think you know any safe relationships, watch television or movies.
Find some. They are out there.
They are out there, and observe what makes that a healthy, safe relationship. How is that different from some of my relationships? And if you can find people in your world, it can be in community groups, it can be in friendships, it can be through sports, through study, at work. But if you can find people that actually treat you with respect and give you the experience of what a healthy, safe relationship looks like, that can be very powerful. Because number one, it starts to give you a new sense of who you are. If you've only ever, experienced fairly abusive or toxic relationships, then the message you get indirectly is I'm worthless or I'm bad. And so actually mix with people who give you a different sense of yourself. I think the other thing is that's really important is to start to maybe work on some what I'd call self-regulation. So sometimes we've been through a lot of awful trauma. We haven't necessarily learned to recognise the signs in our body when our emotions are getting really big.
Next question about the preparing. Like, how do we prepare and understand our trauma and our responses to be able to manage it?
Yeah, so glad you asked that.
You're welcome.
So one of the really interesting things is, and again, much more, this is much more of an issue with childhood trauma, but it can still be an issue with adult trauma. The way that we learn to recognise our emotions and manage them and regulate them is often that we have a caregiver who's sort of, when they notice that we're distressed, if you think about a little baby, people will comfort the baby and they'll settle them. And so we learn as little kids and babies that even though we get distressed, that we can be soothed and calmed and come back to a place of feeling okay again. And that is kind of like a foundational experience we have to have from someone else to start to
do it to ourselves.
Do that for ourselves.
Yeah, it's a good
brain pathways. So sometimes not all of us have had that. And so, there's a lot of really good resources. If you don't want to go and see someone for therapy, there's a lot of really good resources out there. But start to think about what does it look like to, how do I even know what emotions I'm feeling? What do they feel like in my body? What are the sensations that tell me I'm happy? What are the sensations in my body that tell me I'm sad? Or what are the sensations that tell me I'm getting angry? And then, I often say to people, it's kind of helpful to have a little bit of a scale. Like with children, we might do a 0 to 5 or 0 to 10 scale, but the same with adults. There's a difference between me being irritated and being in full-blown rage.
Correct.
So when
can feel similar sometimes.
Can feel similar. But when I'm irritated, I still can, from that place, regulate myself. And I recognise when my anger levels are starting to really increase, because I can recognise the warning signs in my body, that, I probably need to do something to remove myself or regulate myself before I act out of that place of anger and I do damage to myself and to my relationships. So I think learning I don't like to use the word emotional intelligence because it almost sounds, I don't want to.
No, I understand what you mean.
Common phrase used.
It's the ability to read yourself.
The ability to read yourself.
To read yourself. And I say to people all the time, you need to learn to be able to name the emotion.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I think as adults, we've forgotten or maybe never learnt.
Yes.
You look at little toddlers or kids and they're able to say, I'm sad or I'm happy, right?
Yeah.
As adults, I don't necessarily think we're great at that, and especially some of the bigger ticket emotions.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. I think it's that awareness of how I'm wired and knowing some of the warning signs.
Yeah.
And I'm not at a red flag yet, but I can give you a hot tip. It's not white.
Yeah.
I'm heading.
That orange.
Yeah.
So, and I love that idea, the red flag. Recognize, number one, when I'm in that orange zone, if you think of traffic light, when I'm in the orange zone, where it's starting to get in the danger zone.
Yeah.
And number two, learn some strategies. What do I need to do when I recognize my emotions are starting to get a bit out of control before they get out of control? So if I'm at a 5 out of 10, that's probably a good time to start thinking about how do I put the brake. Not that we don't want you to process the emotion, but how do I manage this in a way that I get a good outcome? So if I am really upset or angry,
if I've been triggered by something or a conversation or an event, I don't want to land at a 10 and not have known how I got there.
Yeah. And then I've got a big mess around.
Correct.
So number one, what are my red flags? Number two, what do I need when I'm in that place?
Yeah.
So what is going to work for me to, and I'm not saying you don't need to process it, but just to calm, maybe remove myself or calm myself or self-care so that I don't go into that red zone where it's just really ugly. And I do, I think we've all done that, where we do things that we regret because our emotions have taken over.
Yeah.
And that is something that we can see a lot in trauma response. And then we have more life problems.
Yeah, and then we have the surrounding people that have lack of tolerance, right?
Yeah.
Because they just see bad behaviour.
That's right.
Right? And so I do think there's that piece around having ownership over the trauma, not trauma owning us.
Absolutely.
And there's a really big difference.
Yeah.
Tell me, what would you, I guess, say to people who have experienced trauma in the minors, in the majors? Like, I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. It's like, is there hope?
Yeah. It's a great question because actually there is so much hope.
Because people don't believe it, right?
No.
People think I have people, you would have people.
Yeah.
I've experienced in my life with friends and family that it's never going to change.
Yeah.
There is no hope.
Yeah.
For like, this is how I'm going to be, or this is change me forever.
Look, it probably does change you forever, but there is a lot of hope. And I've worked with people who've had a one-off trauma or people who've been through ongoing horrific childhood trauma, and there is so much hope. I think they're both very different pictures. There is a wonderful organisation that you can Google called the Blue Knot Foundation. I think it's blueknot.org.au, and they have so many wonderful resources for people who've been through trauma or for, families of or professionals, but they just say there is so much hope that people can and do recover from the effects. And it looks so different for everyone. For some people, it's learning how to calm themselves, how to regulate emotion, how to develop a new sense of self-worth that's not informed by the voices of the past.
Yeah.
But then often it's actually helping people maybe learn some life, because, if you grew up in a home that was dominated by traumatic abuse, it may be that you don't have all the life skills that many of us take for granted. So actually, and that's why I probably love counselling, is someone who actually walk the journey with you and actually
start building those skills.
Help you build those skills, give you an experience of a secure relationship, help you get a new sense of yourself. There's so much that can be done even just through a safe relationship, but there's so much hope.
There's so much hope.
There's so many wonderful resources.
Doesn't feel like it always when people are in it.
Yeah.
And I often say to my clients, I know there's hope because I've walked people through from I'll get the call the day of, and then 10 years later, right? Yeah. And what I also really, truly believe is it doesn't have to be a life sentence.
No, it absolutely does not.
it's always going to be part of your life.
Yeah.
Right? But it doesn't actually have to be a life sentence. And I think that's really important to understand when you're in the early stages, the middle stages, and then in the stages where it just walks alongside of you.
Absolutely. One of the things I love to do with people is to, they might come to me after having quite a traumatic background and feel like this is my life. And I like to reframe things a bit because they sort of look at it from a problem-filled perspective. And I understand it's been horrific. I don't want to minimize that. But then I just look at them and I say, how on earth have you made it this far? Like
how are you standing up?
How are you standing up? You've been through things that I can't even imagine. I mean, I feel teary just thinking about it. And you are standing here, you're holding down a job, you're or not,
or not, doesn't matter.
But you survive.
Yeah.
You're here. You've actually got yourself here to talk to me. You can, you have got so many coping strategies and resilience and ways. You've already done so much to survive. And often it's just a matter of, number one, recognizing you have all these strengths you haven't even been aware of.
Yeah.
And number two, going, those things helps you to survive, but how are they working for you today in adult life? And are there some things that maybe you want to do differently or you want to be different? And we can all grow and change. No one's immune from that. And no one's exempt from that. And so regardless of what you've been through, there's so much hope for growth, for change, for meaningful living ahead. And I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying it's overnight.
No, and we don't say it flippantly. Like that's, because I know there'll be people that are watching this and maybe listening to it that are like, I think I'll call rubbish on that. And I get that. Yeah. I get that.
Yep.
But there is hope. Yeah. There's always hope. I have loved our conversation. I feel like we could talk. I mean, this alone could be like 12 hours of conversation. We could, go down massive rabbit holes. But I can't thank you enough for your expertise, for your wealth of information, and just for being a part of this, because I know already that there'll be someone that literally in this moment, wherever they are, needed to hear this, and it's going to be the game changer for their life. So I want to thank you for that, because, for me doing this project, I wanted to have the opportunity of bringing real life conversations that would impact women, especially for good, and for them to have healthy and whole lives. And I know that the topic of grief, and I know the topic of trauma is so massive. And for a lot of people, they don't know where to start. Yeah. And so some people will be starting with this conversation between you and me. So I'm really hopeful for them. And I want to thank you for your time.
No, my absolute.
Yeah, it's been amazing.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful what you're doing. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be a part of it.
360 woman. Let's go.